back to another episode of Tech Pro Unicorn Podcast. I am Michael Grace. I am your host. Today we're going to talk about innovation. We're going to do so in a really cool way, something that's kind of on the minds of, I think, most people right now. We're going to talk about it in the context of public safety and emergency management. We've got an amazing guest, Christopher Tarantino. He's an award-winning entrepreneur, investor, international speaker on resilient innovation. He's worked with thousands of high-performing leaders from startups, enterprise, and government organizations like Google, FEMA, Cisco, other recognizable brands across the globe. With past roles at every level of government, as well as growing businesses beyond seven figures, he is sought after by leaders from both the public and private sectors to transform how they leverage team resilience to drive innovation, which will be the focus of our discussion. He is a leader in the Entrepeneurs Organization, the Young Entrepreneurs Council, and his insights have been featured in magazines like Inc., and as well as CBS, NBC, and a variety of industry publications. As the CEO and founder of Epicenter Innovation, so if you want to follow along at home, the website is Epicenter, like earthquakes, epicenters, epicenter-innovation.com. If you want to follow along at home, you can pull that up. So Epicenter Innovation, which is awarded number 762 in the Inc. 5,000 list of fastest growing private companies. So to be way up there in the top 20% that's pretty awesome. He leads a team focused on human-centered, resilience-focused innovation before, during, and after disaster incidents. So, Christopher, thanks for taking the time, man. What a cool resume.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and excited to talk about this stuff.
Resilience-based innovation. I love the during part, right? During disasters. During disasters, to me, there's no innovation other than pure panic, right? People are scattering, people are seeking, shelter and cover, and maybe they're innovative in how they seek that out. But such a cool topic, right? Talk to me a little bit about how that kind of came to be your area of focus.
Yeah, it's a fun story. I joke that I fell face first and not so gracefully into the field. I started as a first responder, actually, as an EMT and a firefighter, and did hazardous materials and technical rescue and those types of things early on in my career. And at the same time, I was working in marketing and communications and got involved in different business organizations and the like. And really what I wanted to do is marry those two worlds together, because what I saw was that the tools that businesses and tech companies and all these different groups were using to drive revenue and to drive business outcomes weren't the same tools that government or quasi-government agencies were using during disaster. And I thought that was wrong. I thought that was very inefficient. And it, we were using antiquated communications methods. We were just not listening to people. And I thought that we could do better. And so the idea of applying business concepts like entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, innovation management, and those types of things, and even just human-centered change management, just at a general high level, all came really, really to the fore in looking at how we could prepare people before disasters, make them more efficient and effective during disasters, and then also help people recover and adapt for the next disaster, which I think a lot of people kind of forget about, that we're in this cycle of always being ready for the next one.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I spent most of my adult life growing up in California, right? And in California, you just live with, at some moment, right, especially in Northern Cal, where I lived in the Bay Area, and I went through whatever that big earthquake was out there. I don't remember the actual
Northridge or something like that.
No, yeah, it was up in the Bay Area. It was in the San Francisco Bay Area where the freeways collapsed, and there was just chaos, right? There wasn't a good plan. There wasn't a good plan by first responders, who were completely overwhelmed instantly. I was part of the Army Reserve at the time. We were activated into the National Guard, which is the first time that ever happened. We were like, wait a minute, we're federal, now we're state. What the heck is happening? We're just happy to help. It it was really interesting to see a disaster on that scale and literally the lack of preparedness and coordination and communication that happened at all levels, federal, state, local. It was just pure panic and
For
pandemonium.
sure. Well, and that's where innovation sometimes comes from, right? And whether you look at it from the business standpoint or in the world where I spend most of my time, it's sometimes you innovate out of convenience, other times you innovate out of necessity. And it may be simple and not all that glamorous, like you mentioned. The joining up in the reserves and getting assigned something completely different than what you normally had ever seen before. That took some innovation. It may not have been very sexy, but that's the type of thing that we look at, right? Is that there's lots of different definitions of innovation, and even though that's high stakes and high risk, that doesn't mean that we can't innovate, and it doesn't mean that we can't be better after these incidents occur.
Yeah, I love it. Right. I think everybody's familiar with like after action reviews, and it's easy to right hindsight's 2020 to kind of look and go, oh, what could we have done better? Okay,
Sure.
let's create changes based on what actually happened. Um, but I'm also fascinated about the before, right? So you go in and help people really think through the process, right?
Yeah.
Like in so many drills, right, that we go through use such unrealistic scenarios like, oh, what if we're hit by an asteroid and it destroys Earth? And I'm like, then none of it matters, right? You don't need a plan. You're dead.
That's right.
But having realistic scenarios, right, and really thinking through things, and then I just love you blending the technology and the business focus to it, and challenging the status quo to say why not leverage the latest and greatest that's out there so that we have a more appropriate response.
Yeah, and when we first started, Epicenter began as a training company, and what we thought was, we needed to build up the business, technology, innovation acumen across the board in the public safety realm of things, which we did. That's definitely something we needed to do, and something that we spent years doing. But when we took a step back and we looked at what we were actually accomplishing, we're like, well, look, we're actually only approaching half the equation. If we're only talking to the users of technology or to the response personnel, even though we're familiar with those people and they do have a need, we're really only approaching half the equation. We have to also look at the tech players. We have to look at the people that are creating solutions for this environment, the people that are more prone to innovation. And so, we look at it as two sides of the same coin. We have those innovation minded people, business leaders, tech developers, things like that, those solution providers. And we have to educate them and show them what their tool, system, solution can do, what it can provide to this market, and how it can be helped during or helpful during a disaster. Then we also got to show the emergency management and public safety folks that it's not too scary to be innovative during a disaster. And all of that stuff has to happen before.
Well, and I think, from a technologist perspective, we saw incredible innovation with the pandemic, right? The pandemic hit and everybody was like, okay, we can't go outside. We can't continue our normal activities. Uh, you know, Tons of innovation happened in essentially milliseconds, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we get people to see doctors? How do we continue medical services? How do we move supplies? How do we get food to people? How do
Renew your
we,
driver's license, the boring stuff, the necessary stuff. Like,
it was crazy, right? We did it in such lightning speed. Everybody at all levels and all organizations, public, private, nonprofit, medical, industry agnostic, everybody innovated. And what I'm seeing right now, which is kind of interesting, is everyone's like, wow, that was really uncomfortable. And now they're all wanting to slide back to where they were pre-pandemic, right? They all want to go backwards.
and
And
that's
I think people like you and I are like, we thrive on that innovation, right? That coolness. But I don't know that that's the norm, right? I think the norm is people want to be back with the comfortable, this is what I know. Yeah, we're not super advanced, but I feel very comfortable
I think you're absolutely right. And there's so much to what you just said, like lots of different layers, and that's part of the reason why, as an organization, we call it human-centered resilience focused innovation, because you can't take the people out of it as far as we're concerned. We could be a tech company and people have described us that way, we're technology agnostic. And frankly, for us, technology, especially in a disaster, could be the pen and paper or the whiteboard marker that you have in front of you and, some sheets of paper. It doesn't have to be fancy as long as you know how to use it well. And it could be innovative depending on what you put on that piece of paper. Paper's been around for a long, long time, but the innovation happens up here, in your brain. So in addressing that and in honoring that, I think that's where people, especially if you're managers or say you're a tech entrepreneur or something like that, I think the assumption just in humanity is that everyone thinks similar to the way that I do. I think everyone has that predisposition to feel that way. And so the innovators feel that everybody else should be so much more innovative and that, we saw this big change because of COVID. I feel the same way as you do, right? We had this huge change. Everybody's, had 10 years of progress in the span of, 10 months. And I think that's amazing. I think that's great. But like you mentioned, a lot of people feel uncomfortable by that. And well, maybe we moved a little too fast, or maybe we have to patch some more holes. And in harmony, those two ideals can work very effectively with each other. And the way that I describe it is that it's really two different breeds of innovation. You have the light bulb innovators, you have those like disruptive innovators that, in order to get to an innovative place, they usually need to start with a blank piece of paper. They may have some inspiration, but really the idea is new. And we're going to blow up what we did before in order to create that new thing to get to that innovative spot. And other people, actually, I believe most people are more of that incremental process-based innovation where they have to start from somewhere and then get to somewhere else. And you do need both, because if you only do disruptive innovation, if that's all you're focused on, you'll end up with some shoddy product, you'll end up with lots of holes, you'll move a little bit too fast. And that does happen sometimes. So you do need those checks and balances. But if you're only doing incremental A to B, B to C, C to D type of innovation, you're probably not going to change the world. You might change some things, but you're probably not going to have a really dramatic impact. So we need to find a balance between both. And so that rubber band effect that you're talking about of like, we were able to expand really rapidly and grow a whole lot very quickly. The natural progression, the natural next stage is to go, all right, well, let's snap this back a little bit and get to a little bit of a sense of realism. As long as we're better than before, I'm okay with it. I really am, because I think COVID will end up going down in history as being net good, not to discount the terrible pain and everything that came along with it. Absolutely, that is true. But I think in terms of when you look at technology and you look at business growth and the evolutions that we've seen the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of things change, and a lot of people tap into resilience that they didn't even know that they had.
I love it. We use the term resilience and then innovation, right? And some people might say those are opposite, right? Like you can't innovate and be resilient, right? Maybe talk a little bit about how those two kind of pair up together.
Love that. And when I talk about these two, I frequently use an analogy. An analogy is a plant called the fireweed. I don't know if you've heard of this, but the fireweed is this plant that's evolved to grow over time in very like ashy, burnt soils. So it's changed it's the way that it grows, so that way it can survive in an area where nothing else is thriving at all. And what it does is when it grows in those areas, it was the first thing to grow after Mount St. Helens erupted about a month later, first thing after wildfires frequently. So if you go into an area where there's like a burn scar, you'll frequently see these pink, purple type flowers all over the countryside. That's fireweed. It was also the first thing to grow after the bombing of London in World War II. And so what it's done is it's become more innovative to grow in those areas. And it's created a more resilient structure for itself. So that way it can thrive in areas where it probably shouldn't be able to. And then the next thing it does, very simply, is it creates this root structure and this opportunity for the rest of the growth that needs to come back later to grow on top of it. So it creates this scaffolding-like root structure that encourages the pollinators and the animals and all these other things to come back to create that sense of normalcy. So the analogy, the reason why I use the fireweed plant as a great analogy to that is that it's harnessing the power of both of those concepts in a unified way. And then it becomes of value, not just to itself. So it's not just growing in its own industry, but it's growing everybody else alongside of it. And it protects the area around it. So by creating that solid structure, other things can grow on top of it. And it protects the soil from eroding further and creating damaging landslides and mudslides and floods and things of that nature. So they can be perceived as opposites. I understand what you're saying, but I would challenge that to think that, if you really focus on what resilience means to you, and if you build resilience first, that then innovation is naturally going to follow. And that's where I've seen the tech industry, especially, right? I know the audience of this podcast, we tend to focus so much on innovation as the outcome, when in reality, if we focus on resilience first, we'll create a more stable foundation for innovation to thrive.
I love it. What a cool analogy, leveraging a plant that I didn't really know existed.
It's
The
beautiful plant. It
fireweed.
makes great honey as well. It's a really cool, beautiful plant.
That's awesome. It's funny how nature, right? Just you think, oh my gosh, how is this area going to ever recover? And
And
then
it does.
here's life springing back up, which is awesome. So your team, right, gets to go do this really cool innovation with public sector, with government agencies. Um, how is it to lead a team, right, that not only innovates themselves, right, but creates a culture internally of innovation and then has to project that into these agencies that I can tell you nobody ever thinks public sector and goes, those are innovative people.
You're right. You're right. It's exhausting. I think that's the first word that comes to mind. But empowering also. We really do have to look at everything that we're doing, right? Because as a team, like you said, we have to innovate ourselves. We have to stay learning and growing and challenge what we do, elevate our perspective. Always, always, always doing those things. And inevitably, as a team, that can be tiring because you're always having that metacognitive conversation with yourself and with other people that you're working with of like, what's working, what's not working, how do we tweak this? And that's not unique to the innovation space, but I think it's much more prevalent there and much more top of mind to be like, okay, we did this thing that went great. Let's figure out why it went great, or the opposite, right? That really sucked. Why did it suck? How can we make sure it doesn't suck next time?
Yeah.
And I think going through that process and doing it as quickly as possible is really, really important. There's this concept in the military that you've probably heard of, given your experience, called the OODA loop. It's a situational awareness framework. It stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And the OODA loop was designed for physical situational awareness when you're out in the field and you're kind of watching your back type of thing. And I think the initial application was for like fighter pilots to be able to observe their surroundings as quickly as possible and then act on those surroundings and the inputs that they're digesting. But the same thing is true if you're in business or you're trying to innovate, whether or you're in government, right? We know that they take a little bit longer, but I think the shorter time that you can take to go through that OODA loop to observe, orient, decide, and then act what the appropriate course of action should be, the more successful you're going to be across the board, regardless of what you're trying to do. So always we're evaluating ourselves, we're watching what we're doing, we're observing what's happening, we make decisions. And in our team, it's very much similar to the tech culture where it's like, it's better to make the wrong decision quickly than to make the right decision in 6 years. In the disaster space, there's definitely a balance between the two because a wrong decision has much different consequences than, we didn't convert, X number of people like our goal expressed. It's, these people maybe didn't make it. That's not a good conversation to have. But there is a happy medium in there somewhere where you can still innovate and be more incremental with what your expectations are. So we are evaluating that in ourselves. And then we have to find a way to package the stuff that we learn internally to share it with our clients, to share it with the people that we're coaching. We call those people resilience innovators because they're not necessarily emergency managers. They could be business owners. They could be tech leaders. They could be campus safety type professionals. But they're people that have a resilience imperative in their organization. And what we do is we say, look, here's what we've learned. Here's what we've seen. Here's the best practice from the last incident. And here's how you can use it. Because I think a lot of people are digesting a lot of information, but it doesn't always go very far. And we're just exhausted from digesting so much and trying to take in everything that we can, but then we just don't do much with it. So you're really good at the first part of the OODA loop, but not so much of the second half. So we have to package all that up for our people and make it more palatable for them.
I love it. How do you find folks, right, that have been in this? I mean, granted, in public sector, you're in a slice of public sector. You're not down hanging out at City Hall, with some of the typical visions that probably come to mind. You're dealing with people that are typically people of action, right? People that are
Yes.
first responders and public safety and such. Uh, when you bring that human-centered component to that, is that something new? Like they just haven't really focused on it that way? How do they react to kind of the messaging and the training that you guys are bringing?
I love that question. Yeah, it is pretty new. I would say, focusing on people in a disaster is not completely new. We definitely have evolved over time. When you think of some of the major incidents in our history, at least in the United States, we think of Katrina, we think of Hurricane Sandy, maybe you think of Hurricane Harvey or Maria from 2018, or more recently, some of the more wildfires that we've been dealing with. There are some notable incidents that we've seen, and as a result, notable changes with how government has evolved and grown, especially from, you compare 2005 Hurricane Katrina to the FEMA of today, and it's not even close to being the same organization. Not without opportunities, of course, but definitely different and definitely evolved. And so when you look at that, I think it's interesting to evaluate what that means for government, what that means for the stakeholders that we're working with, and being able to communicate that in a way that is, again, like I said, palatable to the people that we're trying to speak to. So as a business leader, that's tough because we're trying to, like you said, very, very astutely, we're trying to sell innovation to people who are mostly focused on risk. And those two things have a very challenging relationship with each other. You can't have innovation without risk. And I think everyone knows and understands that. But it's much more challenging to communicate with that person and apply it to their situation when they're in the grip. You have to be able to speak to them about the outcomes they're trying to produce and set them up before an incident occurs. So that way they're comfortable testing the waters, that they're comfortable not just using a checklist, but coloring a little bit outside the lines and doing so in a respectful way and doing so in a way that doesn't break all the rules. So you can still have disruptive innovation in crisis, even outside of government, right? You might deal with a crisis with your user interface, or your website goes down or something like that. Crisis is a subjective term, and whatever you define as a crisis or a disaster may not be the same way that I define it, and that's fine. We don't need a unifying definition. It's just whatever exceeds your capacity to respond to it. And when you have the tools necessary and you've built a resilient team, you can respond much more effectively and bounce back. The difference between that and being what we call a resilience innovator is not just bouncing back, but then bouncing forward, getting to a point where you can learn from what has happened and then apply that learning to be better than before, and better in such a way, that kind of anti-fragile way, that you're grateful that the incident, whatever it was, happened, because now you're better off for it. That's tough to eke out.
Mm-hmm. Does to me, what's coming into my head, right, is like a framework or a kind of a methodology for them to follow. Like, ooh, I'm faced with this challenge. It's new to me, but instead of panicking, I'm going to follow this path, right? I'm going to down this framework, because I've been trained, because I've been educated.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like if I had, those tools, like you said, kind of in advance, right? If I had that training and that understanding, then it kind of doesn't matter what comes at me, because I have a way to process or deal with it.
100%. And that's exactly how we teach emergency management in the purest form of that definition. We call it an all hazards approach. There's no need to train government officials or public safety professionals how to respond to tornadoes and hurricanes and wildfires and all these other things independently. There are nuances between all of those things, of course, but there's a core framework that we can teach, and we do teach, to help people respond more effectively to anything. And then even if you don't have a playbook, you don't have a rule book, you're like, wow, I've never seen this before. You're like, well, that's okay, because it's similar to this other thing that I have done. And that speaks to that psychological, sociological connection between how our brains work and how that like OODA loop process works. Our brains are always reaching back into the metaphorical Rolodex to say like, oh, have I been here before? Have I seen this before? What's similar to this? And where resilience can sometimes falter is if your situational awareness isn't that high, then you don't know where to reach on the shelf and you're kind of there frozen. And so being able to teach people how to do that at multiple levels is huge. So the way that we describe it is building resilience from the inside out. So you have to have resilient people, then you can create resilient teams, and those resilient teams then create innovative culture because they're stable, they're structured, and they know what to do, and they're comfortable with whatever's going to be thrown at them. Whether we're talking, an earthquake or we're talking a system outage or something like that, it doesn't really matter what it is as long as your people know and are comfortable, responding appropriately.
I use a term a lot, and I call it stabilize and optimize, right? Because you can't innovate or optimize or grow if you're constantly in chaos, right? If you're
Absolutely.
fighting fires, if you're unsure what to do, if you're kind of like almost parallels your Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? Until we address food, clothing, shelter, and get kind of everybody calm, right? Or content that their base functionality is met, it's really hard to get them to be able to innovate, to feel comfortable with growth.
You can't innovate from a deficit, right? And as much as a disaster may seem like a deficit, you decide whether it's a deficit, not the
Right.
scenario. You may be knocked down and it may be tough and it may take a long time. And I think COVID was a great, somewhat recent example of many industries and many businesses experiencing that, where they were down for quite a while. And they didn't always have the resources that they needed or wanted in order to capture opportunity or even stay afloat in some cases. But
Mhm.
you choose how you respond to that, and you choose what you do with that. So having a high internal locus of control and believing that you have control over your own destiny, that's a huge internal factor. I talk about building resilience from the inside out. If you start with that belief, no matter what happens, you're going to be all right. You'll be okay.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. You guys are in emergency management and helping folks be better prepared. How did COVID affect kind of your business of serving that community that obviously was at the center of a pandemic for 2.5 years?
Like, how did we work with those people, our stakeholders?
Well, yeah, and how did it affect your business, right? Were you like were they calling on you and you guys were like super busy going, oh my gosh, like we've
Yeah,
been crazy.
we were very busy. It was an interesting contrast, especially to some of my entrepreneur friends, where they were obviously very not busy and struggling and things like that. And I think it's a good understanding in a very macro sense, but also on a micro level of how dramatic the shifts can be, and how one industry can be doing very well at one moment and not very well at the next moment. And that rubber band effect shows up in a lot of different ways, at an industry level, at a market level, even geographically, and things like that. And we saw that more dramatically, I think, in the later phases of COVID, where some areas were open 100% and their cases were very low, and then other areas were entering into a sixth subsequent lockdown because they just couldn't get their numbers down. And it's just kind of interesting seeing that contrast. So to answer your question, we were very busy during COVID. We have a deployment support unit, Epicenter deployment support unit, that provides disaster staffing, innovator type mentors that can come in and support from a personnel standpoint and say, all right, what are your objectives? What are you trying to accomplish? How can we help you get there faster and more efficiently in the middle of a disaster? And so we had multiple disaster operations that we deployed to, some in DC, some in Denver, all around the country, where we would provide those people and then mentor them on things that they could do to be more efficient. And two quick stories on that, of like how innovation came around. One was a call center that we worked with, and we got a call. We were already staffing their operations center, which is very much in our wheelhouse, something we do regularly all around the country and North America for the most part. And I got a call and they said, hey, we're having trouble with our call center. And we're like, okay, we don't do that, but what do you need? What's going on? And so they described this problem where they just, they were getting an overwhelming amount of calls and they weren't able to route them appropriately. The systems were broken, and they didn't need a call center person. They needed, and this is, to their credit, they knew to call us because we were able to break this apart into its component parts and make sense of what actually was going on. They needed someone who could look at the system, streamline it, make it effective, figure out what the personnel issues were around the system, why it wasn't working, was it the leadership, was it the people that staffed it, and then help enhance the system and where it fit in the overall operations framework. We're like, oh, well, we do all those things, of course. It doesn't matter that it's a call center, right? Talk about that all hazards approach. So the knee-jerk reaction even we had was like, oh, well, this isn't a job for us, but it ended up being something that was very dramatic. And so they went from having thousands of calls that were getting dumped to voicemail, and people were looking for information and not finding it, very frustrated. We heard all these stories, right? This was the environment that we were in. And by the end of week 1 of this project, we got their call volume down, I think, to we reduced about 90% because we were routing it to the appropriate parties rather than sending them to this. They were just getting calls dumped to this call center. And they would get calls that didn't matter and couldn't be answered by these people. So then the call center staff would go, well, I can't answer this anyways. I'm going to send them to voicemail. There was no process for where those voicemails went. So then they just went into a black hole. So then they'd call again. Right. And so there were all these other issues. And, and basically we went through and looked at each of the problems and went through and took a systems-based approach, which is very comfortable in the technology space. Well, our system's broken, our platform is buggy. Let's go through line by line and figure out what's happening and figure out what we need to do about it. And so we were able to do that, but then take that human-centered approach and take that a little bit a step further. The other point of innovation during COVID that we had, and there were lots. These are just kind of the most fun ones on the top of my mind, was we actually created a PPE reselling business over a weekend. And we became the largest distributor of PPE in our region and in our hometown of Denver, Colorado. We were the largest supplier for the city and county. And we did it in the span of about 48 hours. And not because we wanted to. We're never resellers. We don't do that. We're trainers, we're coaches, we're a lot of things, but we are not resellers. But we got phone calls on either side of the public and private fence, so to speak, where public sector was desperate for PPE and they were asking us where they could find it. And then we got calls from our private sector friends and they were saying, hey, we want to keep our operations open. We want to keep the lights on and we're threatened, to be shut down. How do we start making PPE and start filling these gaps? And we took a look around and we're like, well, if no one else is going to be creating this middle ground, then I think we have to, at least temporarily, to help, fix the supply chain and heal it in some way. So we created a PPE chat bot that educated these buyers of PPE that had never bought PPE before. Sorry, using PPE, personal protective equipment. I think I've said it a few times. Most people know it by now, but personal protective equipment. And they had never bought it before, so they didn't know what they were looking for. The CDC guidance was extremely confusing at the time. They were using PPE at a very fast rate, but they didn't know exactly how fast. So we took the CDC's burn rate calculator, basically calculating how fast you're using personal protective equipment at your agency. We stuck it into a chatbot with pictures and definitions of all these different pieces they could use, even a whole host of things that we were not reselling. We didn't resell most of these things, but we built it as an education tool first to help the consumers better understand what it was that they needed, so that way they could find what they needed. And doing so in such a rapid fashion obviously created holes. It was not super fun the first week because we had a lot of fires to put out, but it did help. And we got to a point where we served almost the entirety of the United States, almost all 50 states. I think we may have even done a little bit in Canada. And then we were able to close it down a couple months later because it's not our space. And so we knew that. And we didn't, the orders started to trickle in a little bit less and less. And we were like, oh, cool. I think the supply chain is starting to fix itself. And so we did our work and we bowed out. So those are two really fun stories, I think, of how we were able to kind of capture innovation during crisis.
I love it. Yeah. I think, we all, everybody wanted to help, right? And there was, you had people, individuals making, cloth masks because that's what they could do, whether they met standards or not, right? They were like, I'm going to do this and hopefully it helps somebody, right? Everybody, you saw companies coming to the aid, whether it was, restaurants with free food for first responders, whether it was staffing agencies trying to figuring out how to move healthcare workers around the United States to wherever, the spikes were. It was cool to see that human component really come to life, and it's unfortunate that it only gets really covered when there's a disaster, right? When an incident, then you see the humans, right, come out, and they just this outpouring of support and help. Um, we use human-centered quite a bit in technology, right? We always start with the end user in mind. What experience do we want them to have? And then we back up with, don't worry about the technology, right? We'll figure out the technological back pieces. And in our world, so many people get focused on the software. They're like, oh, I bought this software. What do I do with it? And I'm just like, what do you want to do with your customers? And so often they're like, I bought a hammer. And I'm like, well, you really need a screwdriver. You shouldn't have bought the hammer. You should have figured out that you needed a screwdriver first.
Yep.
I love the planning, before action.
Yeah, and it's not always possible, but it's always possible to get ready in some way. You can't plan for everything, but you can be ready for everything. And I think that's a dramatic difference in mindset. And all those people that you mentioned, the people that are feeding firefighters and the people that are making masks, those are all resilience innovators. Those are all people that are trying to fill gaps and things. That's innovation. Mm-hmm. Innovation is all about, I see a gap, I see an opportunity, I see something that can be different, and I'm gonna take the action that needs to be taken. I'm gonna make the effort to fill that gap and make it better than it was when I found it. That's all innovation is, and there's so many opportunities to do that before, during, and after crisis.
Awesome. So, focusing on your story a little bit, right? Relatively young to have your own company, to be leading, to be out there creating these programs. We get a whole bunch of people that are like, how do I start my own company? How do I, and I always tell them, like, all my entrepreneurs that run companies have one thing in common, and it's hustle, right? Like, these are not guys sitting around for 3 hours every night staring at a plastic box, right? These are guys that had an idea, and girls, right? That had an idea and worked hard, really hard to bring it to life, right?
Yeah.
Talk to me about any, inspiration you have, especially for younger folks that are interested in starting a business.
Oh, for sure. So I coach a lot of young entrepreneurs, and I'm on a lot of boards and things, nonprofit and for-profit, especially attached to investing and those types of things, both in public safety and outside. I never really fully identified with the persona of the entrepreneur until actually somewhat recently, and it took a long time for that journey to kind of manifest itself in me as not just a business owner, but as an entrepreneur. And I think, like you mentioned, that's a different hustle, because you can own a business and do nothing with it and just take checks in. And for some people, that sounds really great. Some days I am also in that boat. That sounds really great sometimes, but I wouldn't be able to sit still for very long because I have that entrepreneurial itch. I have to keep moving. I have to solve problems. I have to be engaged. So one of the first things I do is when I coach newer entrepreneurs is I tell them, look, if you want me to actually coach you, here's what's going to happen. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to convince you not to be an entrepreneur. And if I can convince you, you shouldn't do it, because if there's any external factor, my opinion, anybody else's opinion, that can shake your resolve, there's no way that you'll survive, because it's not for the faint-hearted. It's not for the weak. It's not always easy, and it's not just not easy for an afternoon. It could be not easy for years. Until you reach adoption, or until you break through the wall, or whatever, until you learn enough about yourself where you stop getting in your own way. There's so many reasons why it's going to suck. And I'm going to do everything I can in our initial couple meetings or coffee chats, whatever, to convince you that you have a terrible idea and that you're not the right person to pursue it. And if you are resolved after those conversations, then we'll have other conversations for sure, because that either means you're very stupid or and a lot of entrepreneurs, are myself included, stupid.
I love that.
Or it means that you really do have the drive necessary to overcome these challenges that you're going to face. Because I think it seems very sexy. It seems very interesting, intriguing, exciting to be an entrepreneur. And people are always like, oh, well, yeah, every day is Friday for an entrepreneur, right? You own your own business. Yeah, it's true. Every day is Monday also. Doesn't matter if it's Saturday, it's Monday. And I think a lot of people forget that, and they see the romanticized kind of projection of the media and things like that. And not to say that entrepreneurship isn't cool. It's very cool. I enjoy it a lot. I love having a day that's different from the last, and different from the one before that, and different from the one that I had 3 years earlier. But not everybody has the stamina for that. And in fact, a lot of individuals think they are. They're think they're in that kind of fight, but they're not actually. So the first thing that I let people know, in addition to trying to dissuade them from their pursuit, is I have them think about their level of self-awareness and really diving into knowing yourself. Because an entrepreneur, if nothing else, has to be a master of their own environment. You could be a master of the market, you can be a master of advertising, you can be a master of so many things, and none of it will matter if you're not actually a master of yourself.
I love that. So much of what you said just rings true for everyone. When I was doing small business consulting on the side, I tell people the most valuable thing I'm going to tell you is not to do it, right? Because I'm going to save you the pain. I'm going to save you the cost. I'm going to save you the second mortgage on your house. I'm going to save you all this craziness that you're going to go through, because you can't tell me why, right? I always just start with, like, why? Like, what is your purpose? And so many people are like, well, stop telling me about you. Tell me about your purpose, right? Like, what are you really trying to do here? And why do you think there's value in it, right, to consumers? And so many business owners can't articulate that,
It's hard.
right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge even for established businesses, because if you're constantly reinventing yourself, as an innovative company is apt to do, the vernacular is going to change. The story is going to change. It may not change dramatically from week to week, but you come out with a new tagline or a new phrase or something like that, and you need to be agile to be able to still be congruent and still be consistent with what you're trying to do, not jump from lily pad to lily pad and not actually get anywhere. But you do need to be agile and flexible and figure out where it is that you're trying to go, and how you can make those subtle tweaks and shifts to get yourself there. It's not always about the big pivot.
I love it. Well, Christopher, very cool. I love. I'm going to go look up fireweed plants. That's something that I'm taking from this episode for sure. But for the work that you're doing, in the sector that you're doing to create resilience innovators, so that when we need these folks, right? When bad things happen to good people, perhaps, right? They've thought about it in a sense of innovation, and the response will be better, faster, or more appropriate. So, great work you're doing. Really cool internally to have a team of innovators and lead that, and then the work that you do with your customers. It's very, very cool. So, thank you for sharing all that you shared, especially the fireweed plant, and your stories with us here on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a blast, and please stay in touch.
Awesome.